Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be crowned queen at just 16 years old, only to lose your throne and your life after just 9 days? In today's deep dive, we explore the tragic rise and fall of Lady Jane Grey, the brilliant yet doomed cousin of King Edward VI. From her strict upbringing to her ill-fated reign, her story reveals how ambition and religion collided in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. Stay tuned to discover the secrets behind this young royal's short, dramatic life. In the mid-1500s, Tudor England was a land where faith and politics were so intertwined that changing one's religious allegiances could be a matter of life or death. Imagine a kingdom still reeling from the aftershocks of King Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church, a realm where every sermon, every rumor, and every rumor of a rumor about the line of succession could ignite conspiracies in noble households. Born in 1537, Lady Jane Grey found herself right in the crosshairs of those very conspiracies, simply by virtue of her bloodline. She was, after all, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII. Her grandmother was Mary Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, and once queen consort of France. In a different world, that link might have been merely an interesting family anecdote. But in the Tudor world, where lineage spelled destiny, it was a loaded pistol primed to fire the moment opportunity arose. From birth, Jane was enveloped in the swirl of aristocratic ambition. Her father, Henry Grey, then Marquis of Dorset, later Duke of Suffolk, was a man who seemed perpetually preoccupied with the idea of climbing the social and political ladders of the realm. Her mother, Lady Frances Brandon, was no less formidable. As a daughter of Mary Tudor, she had grown up within the spheres of courtly privilege and knew all too well how precarious power could be. Court gossip portrayed Frances as harsh and exacting, a woman unafraid to push her daughter toward what she saw as Jane's rightful place among royals. Those who encountered the Grey household sometimes whispered about the sharp discipline inflicted upon Jane. It was said that her parents would pinch and scold her for the smallest missteps, ironically intensifying her natural studiousness. She found solace in books, in the translations of Greek and Latin texts that allowed her to escape the claustrophobic pressures of her immediate surroundings. In that sense, Jane's education became a double-edged sword. She was introduced to humanist ideas through tutors, like John Aylmer, who believed that knowledge of classical languages, theology, and the liberal arts could shape a young mind for greatness. By her early teens, Jane was known to read Plato in the original Greek, while others her age might be dancing or hunting in the fields. This intellectual vigor would soon be overshadowed by the harsh realities of Tudor politics, but it also forged her into a young woman of profound spiritual conviction. Her Protestant faith wasn't just a convenient banner under which she could claim legitimacy. It was a cornerstone of her identity, something that would guide her actions and words during her darkest hours. By 1547, around the age of 10, Jane's life took a complicated turn. She was sent to live in the household of Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, a queen known for her scholarly pursuits and religious reformist leanings. This could have been an idyllic arrangement, a chance for Jane to learn from an intelligent, nurturing woman who shared her Protestant values. But it placed her squarely in proximity to Thomas Seymour, the ambitious brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, and thus uncle to King Edward VI. Thomas Seymour was notorious for his reckless plotting, attempting to gain influence over the young king, or possibly even marry Jane to Edward in an effort to bolster his own standing. The scheme unraveled, and Thomas Seymour was executed for treason in 1549, leaving behind a swirl of scandal that briefly tarnished Jane's image by mere association. She was still just a child, but her name was already being bandied about in the corridors of power, a chess piece in a game she scarcely understood. Perhaps the most pivotal moment in Jane's young life came in 1553, the year of King Edward VI's slow decline. Edward, a frail teenager, was as fervently Protestant as his father had been willful. He was determined, or so the story goes, to keep the English crown out of Catholic hands. After all, next in line, according to Henry VIII's Act of Succession, were Edward's half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary specifically was staunchly Catholic and threatened to overturn all of Edward's Protestant reforms. Sensing Edward's desperation, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, stepped onto the stage. Northumberland was a shrewd power broker, adept at reading the political winds. He convinced the dying king to alter the line of succession, cutting out his half-sisters in favor of the next best Protestant heir, Lady Jane Grey. Now imagine the swirl of emotions in a candlelit room as Edward, barely clinging to life, signs his devise for the succession, naming Jane his heir. Scribes hurry about with quills, dripping ink onto parchment. Lady Jane Grey, recently wed to Guilford Dudley, Northumberland's son, is summoned, perhaps in the dead of night, and told she will inherit the crown. One might fancy that any young person would be thrilled at the prospect of wearing the Tudor crown, but by most accounts Jane was horrified. She reportedly fainted upon hearing the news, protesting that Princess Mary was the rightful heir and that she herself had no desire to rule. But in the Tudor world, personal desire mattered little against the wave of political ambition. Her parents, her in-laws, and a swarm of advisers who saw in Jane a perfect puppet queen, devout, well-educated, manipulable, pushed her toward the throne. On July 10, 1553, she was proclaimed Queen of England. At that moment, the Tower of London transformed from a solemn fortress to an uneasy royal court. Jane's short reign, those infamous 9 days, began in an atmosphere of confusion, where uncertainty hung thick in the air. She might have worn velvet gowns and dined from golden plates, but around every corner lurked a sense of looming catastrophe. Jane's ladies-in-waiting whispered about Mary's growing support in the countryside. Reports trickled in that the common people who loved Henry VIII's eldest daughter for reasons both nostalgic and sentimental were rallying behind her. Meanwhile, Jane's new husband, Guilford, demanded she make him king, a request she steadfastly refused. Some accounts claim Guilford's mother, the Duchess of Northumberland, had a furious row with Jane over this snub. It was said that Jane held firm, insisting that she was queen in name only, that they all owed their loyalty to the new regime Edward VI had decreed, not to personal whims. Others suggest that the friction between Jane and Guilford was minimal, overshadowed by the bigger problem, Mary's unstoppable momentum. Unstoppable it was. By July 19th, support for Mary had become overwhelming. Commoners and nobles alike saw her as the legitimate heir, and London began echoing with shouts of "God save Queen Mary." Realizing the inevitability of Mary's triumph, even Jane's father, who had once been so instrumental in placing her on the throne, turned coat, proclaiming Mary the rightful queen in a desperate bid to save his own skin. The coup collapsed in the blink of an eye. Jane, overwhelmed and perhaps somewhat relieved to be relieved of her impossible burden, was confined to the Tower as a traitor. Now picture Jane alone in her tower cell, the chill of the stone walls seeping into her bones. She was by all means a prisoner, but at first it seemed that Mary might be merciful. Queen Mary herself had endured so much uncertainty in her life, declared illegitimate, restored, shunted aside, humiliated, that she might have felt some empathy for Jane's plight. Jane was, after all, just a teenager, widely perceived as a pawn. Mary indicated that she might spare Jane's life, perhaps confining her to a life of seclusion. One can imagine Jane in that uneasy limbo, her mind retreating into theology. She wrote letters, studied scripture, and clung to her Protestant beliefs. At times, her unwavering devotion to Protestant doctrine would cause friction, even within her prison walls. She famously wrote a letter to Queen Mary, condemning Catholic Mass as evil and devilish. Such frankness did not endear her to Mary's circle of Catholic advisers, but at first it seemed Jane might yet survive. That changed with the Wyatts' rebellion in early 1554. This uprising was triggered by widespread fears over Mary's proposed marriage to Philip II of Spain, a union many English nobles believed would place England under Spanish dominance and lead to a re-Catholicization of the realm. Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, threw in his lot with the rebels, a catastrophic misjudgment. Mary's hold on the throne grew precarious once more, and her advisers clamored for a forceful response. Jane, though locked away, once again became a focal point. As long as Jane lived, rebellious Protestants could rally around her as a figurehead. Mary, pressured by her council, reluctantly signed the order for Jane's execution. She did so not just to punish Jane's father, but to eliminate any potential threat to her reign. In Mary's world, shaped by fear and the threat of Catholic-Protestant conflict, Jane was a ticking time bomb even from behind bars. And so on February 12, 1554, Jane's final morning arrived. Guilford Dudley, the young husband she barely knew, some suggest she barely liked, was led out to Tower Hill and beheaded. He was said to be in tears, begging his jailers to allow him a final meeting with Jane. Accounts differ on whether or not that meeting took place. Jane, from her room, might have watched as his headless body was carted away for burial. Shortly afterward, she herself was led out to the scaffold on Tower Green, a smaller and more private setting within the fortress's walls. Imagine the hush falling over the small assembly of officials and a few witnesses. A teenage girl dressed in modest attire steps up onto the wooden boards. She attempts to maintain composure, though her hands shake. She recites Psalm 51, an act of contrition that underscores her unwavering Protestant faith. Then, in a moment both poignant and terrifying, Jane is blindfolded, but can't find the execution block. Groping in the darkness, she cries out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A soldier guides her hands, and in one swift, brutal moment, the axe falls. Lady Jane Grey, age 16 or 17, is no more. News of her execution rippled across Europe. Some condemned Queen Mary as a heartless tyrant for shedding innocent blood. Others insisted that the treason demanded retribution, that Mary had no choice. Meanwhile, the myth of Lady Jane Grey as the innocent traitor began to crystallize. Chroniclers recorded her gentleness, her intellect, her devout Protestant faith, painting her as a victim of others' ambition. Historians would later describe her parents as cold, manipulative figures who used Jane for personal gain. Whether that portrayal is entirely fair is difficult to say. Families in the Tudor period often navigated brutal political waters, and even loving parents could be driven to ruthless acts when faced with the promise or threat of royal power. Still, the narratives that followed consistently depicted Jane as the tragic, brilliant girl who wore the crown for 9 days and paid with her life. The cultural legacy of Jane's brief reign is far-reaching. In her own time, she became a subject of whispered conversation in court circles. Some saw her as a martyr for the Protestant cause, citing her final letters and the devout posture she maintained until her last breath. John Foxe would later canonize her in his Book of Martyrs, making her a Protestant heroine whose death paralleled those of early Christian saints in its piety and bravery. Others, both then and in subsequent generations, saw her as a cautionary tale, a young woman ensnared by the ambitious designs of power-hungry men and, some added, an unfeeling mother, proving that innocence is no shield in a world of conspiracies. In the centuries to come, Jane's story would be retold and romanticized by historians, novelists, and filmmakers. Painters have captured that final moment on the scaffold, or the emotional tension of her reign in the Tower, in works that highlight her youth and vulnerability. In the Victorian era, she was almost sanctified as an example of meek obedience and Christian devotion. In more modern retellings, authors have delved deeper into her psychology, imagining the tension between her formidable intellect and the constraints of her environment. Some contemporary novels grant her an inner monologue, revealing her frustration at being dismissed due to her youth and gender, even as she was used as a pawn to claim the highest seat in the land. Yet, for all the retellings, we still lack some crucial pieces of the puzzle. Jane left behind only a few letters, a handful of prayers, and the recollections of those who knew her. Many of those recollections, of course, are colored by the vantage points and biases of the authors, whether they viewed Jane as a heretic, a saint, or a mere scapegoat. Even the details of her marriage to Guilford Dudley remain somewhat murky. Was Guilford truly as arrogant as some have claimed? Did Jane's reluctance to call him king cause a serious rift, or was it simply a minor spat overshadowed by the unstoppable crisis swirling around them? The historical record remains full of gaps. Those gaps, though, open the door to endless fascination. The enigma of Lady Jane Grey invites each generation to investigate anew, to sift through old letters and chronicles, to form fresh interpretations of her short life. One might wonder if Jane was, in some sense, complicit in her own downfall. Did she, in her zeal for Protestantism, fail to see how Mary's supporters would rally around legitimate lineage and Catholic tradition? Or was she truly powerless, from her cradle to her grave, a mere tool to be sharpened, wielded, and then cast aside? Stepping away from the question of her complicity, there is also the matter of her personal beliefs. By all accounts, Jane was deeply passionate about her faith. She corresponded with leading Protestant thinkers, engaged in theological debates, and displayed a maturity of thought well beyond her years. The manner in which she conducted herself during her trial, quiet, dignified, and unwavering, suggests that her convictions were not fleeting. She genuinely believed in the Reformed religion and presumably felt that Mary's Catholic policies would plunge England back into a state of spiritual darkness. That belief, combined with her scholarly pursuits, continues to inspire admiration from those who see her as a paragon of principle, unwilling to recant her faith even if that might have saved her life. One of the more moving accounts of Jane in her final days concerns her letter to her younger sister, Catherine Grey. In it, she urges Catherine to remain steadfast in the Protestant faith, to keep her eyes on the eternal realm rather than the transient glories of this world. It's a letter that resonates across time, showcasing Jane's blend of youthful innocence and spiritual wisdom. She signs off with a reminder that earthly crowns come and go, but the promise of salvation endures. The letter stands as a testament to Jane's sense of responsibility toward her siblings, her clarity of perspective, and her acceptance of the fate that awaited her. In the broader landscape of Tudor history, Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign stands as a kind of prelude to the religious tumults that would intensify under Mary I, who earned the epithet Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, and then shift radically again under Elizabeth of York. It's as if Jane's story functions as a small but resonant chord in the grand symphony of the Tudor dynasty, foreshadowing the violent oscillations between Catholic and Protestant rule, each bringing its own brand of martyrdom. And yet Jane's role in that grander drama is particularly heartbreaking because she was so young, so ill-equipped to handle the forces swirling around her, and because she left this world with barely a ripple on the surface of politics. Her demise didn't halt Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain, nor did it prevent Elizabeth from eventually succeeding Mary and ushering in a new era. In that sense, Jane's life ended without dramatically altering the course of English history. Yet we remember her again and again, almost obsessively. Part of our modern preoccupation might be due to how Jane's narrative fits into a timeless archetype, the innocent teenage girl thrown to the wolves by a calculating adult world. We can relate to the idea of youthful promise sacrificed on the altar of older men's power struggles. This is a story that resonates not just in the 16th century, but in any age that sees younger generations pawns in the hands of the established elite. In her final act, Jane becomes an almost Shakespearean figure, undone by forces too vast and ancient for a solitary individual to tame. Moreover, the personal tragedies that swarm around Jane's story, her father's betrayal, her mother's coldness, her uncertain marriage to Guilford, could fill volumes of psychological analysis. Did Jane crave a normal, nurturing home life, one in which she could simply pursue her studies and devotions without being molded into a political tool? Did she ever experience a glimmer of romantic love? Or was that avenue closed off by the marriage her parents arranged for her? We can only speculate, though her documented tears at her betrothal to Guilford suggest that she dreaded what lay ahead. When we move on to consider her execution day, the poignancy hits a crescendo. Witnesses recalled her quiet dignity, her calm acceptance of the end. There is something undeniably tragic in watching a child, because at 16 or 17, she was still very much a child, exhibited on a scaffold, the gathered onlookers straining to see the last flicker of life in the figure, who, not even 2 years earlier, had quietly studied theology in a corner of her father's estate. And for what? A 9-day reign that was never truly hers, a crown placed on her head by men who sought to manipulate the line of succession for their own gain. History abounds with what-if scenarios. What if Edward VI had recovered from his illness, allowing Jane to remain an obscure cousin in the background? Would she have pursued a life dedicated to scholarship, perhaps writing treatises on scripture and classical philosophy, becoming one of the most learned women of her generation? What if Mary had truly forgiven her and allowed her to live under house arrest indefinitely? Would Jane's presence have continued to spark uprisings, or might she have faded from memory, overshadowed by the intrigues of Elizabeth's rise? We can never know. Instead, we have a finite story, an abrupt ending that feels in many ways like an open wound in Tudor history.